So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from your breakout room. I hope you had a good conversation and that you have met some interesting people and are ready for our conversation this afternoon. So my name is Louise van Rhyn and I feel incredibly privileged to be able to be your host this afternoon for what will hopefully be a very inspirational conversations. Always inspirational for me to be in a conversation with Cormac and all the other wonderful people that we have on the call. So Cormac and Sharna and I have got a bit of a plan for our conversation, but who knows whether it's going to go out the way we've got it planned. But it's nice to have a plan because then at least we have something to kind of go back to. Before we continue, before we hear the voices of these three panelists on your screen, I want to just create an opportunity for anybody else who want to say something about what you've just experienced in your breakout room. Anybody want to share anything about what happened in your breakout room? And the way to indicate that you want to say something is either to unmute yourself or to raise your hand. So let me just check whether, Primi, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did go into the breakout room. There was no one there, so I came back. I was redirected to this. So sorry, I didn't experience anything.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry to hear that. That is such a disappointment. Anybody else who had a different experience to Primi?
Hi, Louise, can I come in?
Yes, Judy.
I was actually directed to room 15. Then after some few seconds, I was redirected to room 14. And that was a privilege to be in the same breakaway session with Cormac, who is our guest of honor today. And I really felt so privileged to have a discussion with him before he can do his presentation. And I'm honored. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I did see that you were alone in the breakout room, and I thought what would be a really good thing for you to do is to go and be with Cormac. So I'm delighted that you experienced that as a good experience. Anybody else want to say something before we go into our conversation?
Yeah,
look like...
Louise,
Yes.
I'll say something. This is the first of these calls I've been on, so I'm grateful. I'm actually grateful to the pandemic that it gives me the opportunity to come in and spend a bit of time with your community. So I had a wonderful check-in with some of your friends and colleagues in your network, and just that in that moment to kind of unexpectedly connect into the South African community in particular. I just hadn't really thought about it when I dialed in, and then suddenly I'm talking to people on the other side of the world about community. So it was really rich, and I'm really looking forward to the next hour or so.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jane. And for those of you wondering, who is Jane? Jane is a friend of Peter Block. And I think what brings all of us together here is Peter is probably the link that got Cormac and Rama and myself connected with each other, and then Sharna as well. So thank you, Jane. It has been the gift of COVID, the fact that we are able to connect across all these boundaries and we have these conversations. And that's why we can have Cormac with us today, because Cormac's dialing in from Ireland and Jane from the UK. So the panelists today are Cormac Russell, and I was thinking, how do I talk about Cormac? So he's a thought leader in the asset-based community development movement. I think, Cormac, that's the right way to talk about it. It's a movement. He's a very close friend of John McKnight. His previous book, which we're not going to talk about today, but just so that you know that, was really around John and John's ideas. John McKnight is the founder of asset-based community development. Cormac is also the author of Rekindling Democracy, the book that we're going to be talking about today. Someone described him to me as he's an ABCD rock star. So that's just so that you know. And he's a fun guy to follow on Twitter. So if anybody wants to follow a really fabulous person, sometimes I see Cormac's tweets and I go, that's why I came on to Twitter today, was just to see Cormac's tweets. So he brings light to my day very regularly, and then he tweets some interesting people. So the conversations are really uplifting. Thank you, Cormac, for that. Then we have Sharna Fernandez with us. She's the Western Cape MEC for Social Development. Apparently she needed to get permission to be with us today as the MEC, but she did. Her premier gave her permission. So we feel very privileged, and thank you for being with us today, Sharna. And Rama Naidu, who's a very dear friend of our community. Dr. Rama Naidu is a community builder and facilitator. So the story, there's always a story around how did we get to be here today. It happened because Bob Jones, and I'm sure Cormac's going to tell us who Bob Jones is, but that's later. Bob Jones tweeted a tweet. He said, "So good hearing from Cormac Russell. If I empower you, who has got the power?" Now that's in itself a really interesting tweet. To which Sharna then responded in September this year, "So sorry I missed this valuable session." Cormac very proactively and opportunistically tweeted back to Sharna, "You were missed, Sharna. Perhaps we ought to have a book launch for South Africa." To which Sharna responded, "Now that sounds like promising. Let me put out some feelers and revert." And Sharna copied the world on this email, but one of the people she copied was myself. So I immediately reached out to Sharna and Cormac and said, let's make it happen. So Sharna, why did you respond in that way to that tweet? What was it? What is it about Cormac's work that has been catching your attention? Why did you want to be at a book launch with Cormac?
Good afternoon, Louise, to Cormac, Dr. Rama Naidu, and all the panel, all the attendees. I've been following Cormac for a little while, and I'd actually wanted to join that specific webinar because I read the book. Well, I haven't finished it yet because Cormac has asked me to say a few words about it. But I try and read 3 books a month, so I'm all over the place. But Rekindling Democracy resonated so deeply with me as I was a business partner with Partners for Possibility. And Louise, you know my journey with Square Primary, going back to my old primary school 50 years later as a business partner or community builder. And the ABCD got to me because in my role as the MEC for Social Development in a COVID environment, I now realize the importance, not that I never did, but now more than ever, we need to build and strengthen communities because communities have agency and individuals that collectively they have agency and power. And Cormac's book just resonated so deeply with me. So that's why I'm here today. And I am extremely thankful to him for accepting and responding to my tweet. It took us all of 15 minutes and we were organized. Thank you so much.
It's the power of social media, Sharna. You and I, just before everybody joined the call, we were talking about how important it is for us to reimagine the role of government with regard to citizens. That it isn't for government to deal with all the issues and create the future that we want. That's the responsibility for citizens. And the role of government is to step in where citizens can't do it by themselves. And in Cormac, that beautiful story about that mayor in Canada, that is just that story about the fish in Canada. So I'm hoping you're going to tell that story as well. But when I read that story, it was just such a reminder of we need to be clear about whose job is what.
Yes.
And with you being in government, Sharna, I'm delighted that you are so committed to take asset-based community development into your world, social development, which is such an important area. So hopefully there'll be more opportunity to hear from you. I want to just also, let's just hear, before we hand over to Cormac, hear from Rama. So Rama, you and I and Cormac met each other in Cincinnati a long time ago. It feels like years ago. And then since then, I'm assuming the two of you remained connected, but tell us, why were you excited about being on this call and joining this conversation?
Thanks, Louise. Several months ago, Cormac asked me to have a review of the draft of this book, Rekindling Democracy. And having looked at the book and read through it, my sense was this is a kind of handbook for anyone involved in community building, involved in democracy. So there's a huge impact of a change of how we view this notion of citizen-centric, Cormac's words, as compared to government-centric. And that shift is so fundamental if we want a thriving democracy. So my previous life has always been about activating citizenship. And when I read this book, I said, where the hell was this book so many years ago? When in fact, we are battling with so many false fuses, false lights of how we bring about an empowering citizens, when this book was saying, unless we have an inversion that's real, that tackles the structure, we will continue just band-aiding the existing system. So Rekindling Democracy, especially Cormac, the notion of the triad of books, and I'm so looking forward to the third one, is I think a set of books for anyone who's interested in making sure that we have a vibrant, thriving democracy. The use of language, the metaphors used, the power of the symptoms and the problems and the connectors and the breakers make the book something very simple for anyone to read. But more importantly than that, raises significant questions for us if we are in any way associated with the notion of activating citizenship. So it's such a pleasure and privilege to be with all of you today. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, Rama. So I just want to also create a link. When we decided we're going to do this book launch, we had to figure out, where do we fit it in? So we made a decision that we were going to make this part of our series of conversations that we have around the new PFP book. However, we're not going to hear from any of the people who've been featured in the book, but it's really just a reminder for me that a lot of what we do in Partners for Possibility is really an expression of the ideas in Rekindling Democracy. So this idea of place-based communities of citizens creating an alternative future, and citizens knowing that they have a job to do. I remember when Peter, all those years ago, challenged us, he says, we're not building community for the sake of building community. We're building community because communities have work to do, and they have to raise our children. And the whole idea behind Partners for Possibility was infused by Peter and John, and now Cormac's ideas. Cormac, I'm starting to think we will have to figure out a way to do a series of courses or webinars or something for our South African community, because there are so many people some lights have been lit, fires have been lit, but now we want to go deeper. But for now, we're going to make the most of having you here this afternoon. So we've decided to just give you a little bit of time to just talk and, questions that I thought might be interesting for people, because not everybody's had a chance to read the book. We do need copies of the book, because we don't have copies of the book in the country at the moment. I read it on my Kindle, but not everybody reads on Kindle. But so we want to hear from you. If you are able to give us just a kind of summary, high-level summary of the book. It's very hard. It's one of those books that's full of gems. Every page, every story, every metaphor is another gem. But if you as the author, what was your key idea? What are the key ideas that you're trying to represent in the book? What were you hoping to achieve? What kind of feedback have you had? I saw some of the launches that's been happening. People are raving about this book, but from your perspective. So I'm going to go quiet, and we are hanging off your every word.
Well, Louise, first of all, thank you very much. Sharna, thank you. Rama, my good friends, all of you, thank you all so much for creating this space, and then for bringing your circle of friends into the space as well. I want to just start by honoring Partners for Possibility and honoring the contribution you've made in South Africa and that you continue to make. And I'm just excited by what you've done as much as by the opportunity to speak about my book. But there's a lot of synergy between what you're doing and what I'm saying in the book, which largely, the whole idea of the book, it really is just a report out on what is happening around the world. People who are taking this idea that if we shift and we pivot away from problems to real possibilities without being afraid to also stare the problems and the challenges and the traumas straight in the eye, but be audacious, and really believe that we have enough within ourselves, and what surrounds us is enough to begin to really flourish forward fairly. And I really believe that, everything that we're seeing these last few months tells me that the strength of the human spirit, when we bring community together is indomitable. You know, this whole idea of anti-fragility. We look at the fragility of our institutions in March and April, and this book came out well before COVID, although we knew this was coming, right? So this isn't new. 10 years ago with SARS, we knew we needed to think about being pandemic conscious. So there's nothing new under the sun here. But what really came across very strongly in March and April, and I guess it's different in different jurisdictions and different countries, but certainly in Ireland and in the UK, in the US, Australia, and a lot of European cities, it was almost like a hydraulic pump, right? And I say, you know, in the book, I use this metaphor. So as the institutional world started going down on this side, what started going up on the other side? Community. So we were seeing people who live and breathe and connect with each other, figuring ways out to adapt to the situation, to use a little bit of what they have, connect it, and mobilize to respond. And people who would have never thought of themselves as possibility oriented, who would never have seen themselves as stewards of a different way, just showed up because they knew if they didn't, nobody else was coming. They became the first responders. Their communities became the front line. And in all kinds of ways, as the institutionalization, as the empire receded, we started seeing right at the edge of the empire, right at the fringe of possibility, this flourishing, vibrant set of invisible assets become visible. So in a sense, that's the essence of what this book is all about. It's really, to go to what Rama was saying, it's saying we have an inversion of democracy where we think that our education and our health and our safety are in the hands of the empire. They're in the hands of the institutional world. And if we could just get better institutions and better professionals and more funding, everything would be better. But the truth of the matter is this revolution, this rekindling, won't be funded. And then COVID comes and does this great reckoning for us in a lot of ways. But it's not just COVID. The reckoning has been coming for a long, long time, and environmental challenges in terms of structural inequalities and so forth. So the book is, it's a summons back to the ordinary. It's a call to become deeply reacquainted with the mundane, with the local, with the parochial, with the personal, with the intimate, with the small, and to entertain the possibility that the things that are close at hand may have been what we've been looking for all our lives, but we've overlooked them. And the radical thought that these things that are being characterized as random acts of kindness and as friendliness and as neighborliness have the power to transform the planet, and certainly our countries. So that's the essence of it. And the reaction to the book has been a little bit surprising. I think because when COVID hit, I thought, well, like you say, Louise, it's been hard to get copies of the book in some countries. But again, people are tenacious, and so have been finding ways of getting it. But we've been just finding friends and fellow travelers to host conversations around the book, and I've been blown away by how kind and generous and hospitable people have been around the principles. But I think the main reason that people kind of are enjoying the book is because it's their stories being told back at them, just like your great work and Rama's great work and Sharna, and there's so many people. I wish I could see everybody on one screen, but I'm just flicking between the three screens. And by the way, folks, if you don't have your camera on, could you please turn it on, because we'd love to see your face. One of the first acts of being in community is showing up. So let's have our cameras on, if you can at all, please. This is a summons to connection. But look, it's been wonderful, and it's great to be with you today in the same spirit.
So Cormac, I personally, so firstly, I have to say that I have a thing about Irish accents. I just love listening to you. But I also love, and I kind of, when I read the book, I was imagining hearing your voice. You have to do you're going to have to do a book that you can listen to because you've got such a beautiful voice. But just for those people who've not had a chance to read that book, and for me, that story about the fish and the mayor in Canada, can you tell us that story?
Sure, happy to. So Amqui is the place that Louise is referring to in Canada, and it's on the Atlantic side of the Canadian coast. So as you'd imagine, they are heavily reliant on fishing, and one of the fish that is very bountiful and abundant on that side is salmon. So their staple and their financial base is salmon fishing. And they are French speaking primarily. So the story goes that one day in Amqui, the mayor of Amqui, who's been the mayor forever, was walking along the street, and three of his neighbors ran, and they were very exercised and being very dramatic, waving their arms. And they said to him, you know, we've got a big problem. And he said, well, what's the problem? And they told him about how a salmon poacher had cut the nets. So one of the things that they do to, you know, catch salmon fish is they drop nets a few miles either side of the village, and essentially they catch salmon that way. It's all done legally, it's done by license, but in any case, these poachers, being opportunistic, cut the nets, and so the salmon were getting upstream, and the poachers were making hay while the sun shone. And these three guys were really alarmed by this, and they wanted to do something. And the mayor of Amqui, Gaston, said, well, he said, that is a real problem. I agree with you. It's a serious issue. What do you think we should do about that? And so the men started speculating on a few things that they thought that they might do. And the mayor said, well, that all sounds very, very solid, very credible. Do you know anybody who could help you with those things? And the men, without stopping for breath, named 2 or 3 other people. And he said, well, that's wonderful. He said, well, now we've got a circle of about 7 people. At 7:30 this evening, I'm going to go to the town hall, and I'm going to open up the doors, and we're going to go in, and you're going to bring these people. We're going to sit down. We're going to figure this out. So I'll see you at 7:30. They said, yeah, sure, that sounds good. And so the 7 of them arrived, and they sat in the little circle at the table, the town hall main meeting room. And the mayor chaired the meeting, but essentially he, again, to use Peter's terms, he was leader as convener. So he didn't direct anything. He didn't suggest anything. He essentially led with really, really clever questions, a curious mind, and quite a bodacious heart. He believed that the people in the conversation, his neighbors, had as sharp a mind as he had, and as noble a heart. And so he just kept saying to them, okay, so what do you want to do? Who do you know who can do it? What resources are you going to use to make it happen? And sure enough, each time they would answer. Now it got to the end of the meeting, which took all of about 40 odd minutes. And they had the workings of a plan that they themselves owned. Like, they acted like citizens, right? In the sense that that's what citizens do. You always know you're in the presence of a citizen because they're doing 3 things. Firstly, they name the possibilities and the problems too. They're not afraid of problems, but they name the possibilities in their own language, what some people would call the vernacular. They're their words. They are not words that were imposed from outside on them, right? So it's not the Queen's English, it's their language. The second is that having named the possibility and owned the difficult parts of that too, then the second thing they do is they name the solution that they believe makes sense in responding to that. What are the possibilities, and how do they make those manifest? What are the solutions? What are the things they plan to do? What's their pledge? What's their promise? And the third thing is they get up off their bottoms and they do it together. So the mayor was seasoned in the art of convening these conversations. So he knew a sufficient quickening had taken place, and it was about time to shut up shop and go home for his supper. And before he left, he said, now, here's the thing, he said, you guys have a plan, and you've got a sense of who's going to be involved in that. But he said, you know, we're here to supplement whatever it is you guys want to do. So you need to tell me what it is that we as a local government can do to be useful. Not get in your way, but be useful to you, okay? So the guy said, well, there's a couple of things you can do. Yeah, but we're not really sure exactly what. Maybe we could come meet the council every 6 weeks and check in. He said, well, here's a thought. He said, one of the things that we can do as a government is we can legitimize what you do. So he said, how about we say that we recognize you as the first Salmon Preservation Society or Committee of Amqui. You are all citizens with authority now. And he said, and this place is your place. I've just told it in trust. So if you guys are a committee, you can have this place whenever you need to have this place. You just need to check, that it's available. But this is your meeting space. And I'd be honored for sure if every 6 weeks you would come and let us know how you're getting along and give us some grief if we're not doing something that could be helpful to you and helping you get along. And that was that. And this guy, just to say the final thought on this mayor, has been playing this, he's been operating out of this playbook for about 20 years now. And near everybody in Amqui is a citizen and is a member of a committee. And in a sense, it is very hard to tell where government ends and citizenship begins. But he's very, very clear that all change starts with citizens neighboring up. And his job is to supplement that, not replace it.
Beautiful. Would you agree that story kind of really, it says it all, doesn't it? It's kind of, it's the executive summary of what's in the book.
It's the exemplary story. The other one, which is for another day, which I particularly like.
Give us the other one as well, Cormac. Well, we love hearing you.
The other one is a little bit irreverent, but it's the very end of the book, which is about where death as a function, is brought back to a community in Kerry and County Kerry. So this story, which is a true story, is a story about a man very dear to the community that died the evening after he buried a neighbor of his own. He was a man who'd never married, so he lived alone, but he was very closely held with his community. Con Carey was his name, and he died after taking a little bit too much in the way of whiskey and Guinness, I think is how the story goes. And so he died on his own, very tragically, during a very wet, wintry evening in County Kerry. And he was buried in, I'm giving you the truncated version, but he was buried in a rush because he had no family. The parish priest took over, buried him in not very respectful way. So he was put into a very rudimentary casket and buried in the clothes he died in. And essentially that was that. But the community were not happy with what happened. Now, this is in 1978 in rural Ireland, and I don't know if you could appreciate this, but I'm sure you can. In rural Ireland at that stage was predominantly Roman Catholic, very, very respectful of priests and very cautious about doing anything that would have been seen to be sacrilegious. But 12 of his friends processed 3 miles to the burial ground where Con was buried, and in broad daylight dug up Con's coffin, who was buried 6 feet under, and washed his body, said prayers over his body, sung over his body, and then they buried him again. And this is very, very serious, criminal offense. But actually what it was an act of deep reverence and love that came from that. The 12 people became known euphemistically as the 12 apostles. But it was a great reminder that even a priest, even in Roman Catholic Ireland in 1978, if he overreaches, if he does the parts the functions that belong to the community, then the community are left with no other choice but to restore the equilibrium. There's a view, I take the view that when a priest or a government person or a health worker overreaches and they do the community part, whether it's around death or safety or health or democracy, the whole cosmos goes out of balance. And the only way to bring it back into balance again is for the community to become active. Now, I think this is exactly what we're seeing at scale around the world at the moment. Our cosmos, in a lot of ways, is out of balance. The way to bring it back into balance is to remember again what we seem to have forgotten, which is there's a whole set of functions that belong solely to the community. And it's only when they take them on and really believe in them that we can get back to right relationship again.
And one of those functions, Cormac, is to care.
Yes.
I think one of the things that I've learned from you and John is that we cannot expect institutions and governments to care. That's the job of citizens. I want to hand over to Sharna so that Sharna can ask you a few questions, and specifically from her role as a provincial government leader. But I just want everybody on the call to know that you hear us use these words regularly, that we're going to focus on what's strong rather than what's wrong. And if I'm not mistaken, Cormac, that comes from you, because that was the first time that I heard it, was when I met you. I didn't hear it from John. I didn't hear it from Peter. So I talked just a little bit about where does that come from? Because it's kind of become a fundamental idea for us in Partners Possibility, and when we use it, we try to remember to credit you. We don't always remember it, but just want to let you know we use those words all the time. Focus on what's strong rather than what's wrong.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's as common as air now, so I don't know if it matters about attribution or anything of that nature. But basically, just very simply, 3 shifts that I commend. One is a shift away from focusing or starting on what's wrong to starting with what's strong. Now, there's nothing wrong with addressing what's wrong in our lives, but we need strength to do that with. So starting with what's strong to address what's wrong and make what's strong stronger. Shift number 1. Shift number 2, start with discovery. Start with that, community piece and really being curious about what surrounds us, rather than that kind of delivery model that says, I'm a client and I need a service. So, and then that final piece, which is so much akin to your work and to Peter's work, which is really about, just so much comes down to relationships, doesn't it? So it's really so much about, let's start with just valuing the connection as a starting point and the connectorship before leadership. We'll figure out where we want to get to eventually, but if there isn't a we, if there isn't a connection, it's very hard. But that's where the strong piece comes from, is this belief. I felt that assets was a word that not everybody would relate to, and it's quite a business word, whereas everybody can relate to strength and strong. And I love rhyming. I was just many years spent my too much time on Twitter trying to find handles and hooks that people would remember.
Well, we love the rhyming as well. Just when you were talking, I was remember when Peter first came and Rama met him, Rama and both, all of us, many of us, he was always telling us he says, I want you to go into these small group conversations and not be helpful to each other. Replace help with curiosity, because being helpful is just a modern form of colonialism. And I can hear, there's so much resonance between what you say and what he said. So let's go to Sharna. Sharna, over to you. You've got the floor now for a few minutes with Cormac.
Thank you, Louise. And firstly, thank you, Cormac, for honoring my request. I never believed that I would even get a response to my tweet, but I was following your work with great fascination. And there's a screen share, Colleen. I think you on the screen. But be that as it may, we are in COVID recovery now. So COVID recovery made us realize that we need citizens to actually make this happen, because as you alluded to earlier, it is actually the citizens who were the first line. And we experienced a food aid crisis, if you could call it that. And citizens rallied around providing food to the most vulnerable. Being in government, it is a very difficult situation for someone who is, I consider myself a social justice activist first and foremost. So you've got to weigh up the priorities of government. And in the Department of Social Development, where we deal with mostly broken, wounded, traumatized people and persons. And when I read your book, the humanity that just came out in there. And so I'm specifically looking at it around the issue of gender-based violence. Why does that vicious cycle continue? So I've started engaging activists in communities, and by partnering with activists in communities, guess what? It starts to fall into place. And similarly, your idea around programs. We cannot, as a government, just impose a program on a community and expect them to take ownership of it. So I have a very different view, and I am part of a greater collective. And, you know, my boss, the premier, always says, you're always beating your drum about community. And I often say, but community, it has to be about community. So I just wanted to know, there are certain instances where social workers absolutely have to get involved, you know, in the issue of, let's say, child abuse or neglect or instances like that. But strengthening the family, to me, is, I think, what is core. So I was at an event last week, and they displayed the fish, the river, and the net, and then the fish that ended up further down the river that got rescued. But so what happens if you're not there to rescue those fish? And the more you tweet, and the more I was very privileged, because I had registered for your webinar on the 10th of September. I got the replay of the webinar sent to me, and that just piqued my interest even more. So I am campaigning vehemently now for you to do a presentation to our Western Cape government, to cabinet. And Louise knows that I don't give up like she doesn't give up. I've been with partners since 2015. I actually went back to work with my old school back in my old neighborhood of 50 years ago. And the journey was supposed to be a year, but it continues. So I want to thank you for, you know, within 15 minutes, Louise had organized, and you really just made it possible so that we could get you in South Africa. And when you said, let's use it, do something in South Africa, I was completely overwhelmed. The one challenge, many people want to read your book, but it is not available in South Africa, as Louise said. And I do know if you order it online, it could take a good 3 to 4 weeks to get here. So maybe we need to just look at that. And then the other concern I have, not all my colleagues share the same mindset that I have. And so I have a battle on two fronts. So what I want to do is I need to work with communities, and I need to prove that ABCD works, it benefits the citizen. And I also need to convince my colleagues, peers, and counterparts. So I just want to say, how do we transition? Because right now we are out of sync. What we have done in the Western Cape, where I live, we have created what is called a hotspot model. And we use that hotspot model where we got medical professionals, communities, faith-based organizations, all in the same room to provide an update on the number of COVID cases, recoveries, you know, bushfires, and. We are now going to expand that to include safety, jobs and employment, and dignity and well-being. But my understanding of dignity and well-being might not be the same understanding, let's say, a mayor or a councillor has. So there's a challenge in there because dignity is not charity. It's not giving people a hand out. And how do I deal with this? I will certainly be engaging you post this webinar together with Louise. And as we spoke earlier before you joined us, I think I was in the room with Daisy and Nina. We want to make the trip and we want to come and visit you and experience it in real life so that we can come back empowered and we can then lead the charge as community builders. So thank you for honoring us. It's a huge privilege to be a part of this conversation and on this platform with you. Thank you, Cormac. Thank you, Louise.
Sharna, you're so gracious, and thank you. Can I just honor you for a moment? There's a lot of messages coming in thanking you for who you are as a person. I think it's really, really important to lift up the fact that the work you're doing, the work Louise is doing, the work Rama is doing, and the work that many people on this call and others who are not on this call is ABCD. The genie is out of the bottle in South Africa. People should be visiting you. They should be listening to you and learning from you. It's my honor to be with you today. So you're very gracious, but really I'm just your number one cheerleader and happy to be along for the conversation. Look, sometimes what ends up happening with this is we try to live and embody what we're doing, but we know that there's a whole range of cross pressures that either mean that it isn't going as slow or it isn't going as fast, I should say, as we'd like it, or it isn't going as deep and it isn't as authentic. And I don't think, you don't strike me as somebody who's in a hurry for hurry's sake. I think what you're calling for is authenticity. And we don't lift people up by putting them down, right? So, what you're advocating for is authentic practice, not kitsch programs or quick fix solutions. And that's the essence of it, whether we call it ABCD or Partners for Possibility or, that it comes down to how we show up as individuals and how prepared we are to convene conversations where, we begin to say, okay, if we took seriously the idea that the primary unit of change is the neighborhood, the township, the village, and that if we could begin to not convince, but convene everybody into a conversation that says, you have gifts to give, and we can't do without them. What might that actually do? Now, one of the things, because you'd mentioned violence, just to pick up on your different sharings, because they're so rich and multi-layered. Violence is what people do with their suffering when they don't know what else to do with it. How do we enable people to transmogrify, to change, to create a new expression of suffering that takes it into a meaningful contribution, which allows them to flourish forward fairly? How do we do that? How do we ensure, instead of this model of mass production, that we create a context where every person can feel productive? How can we create a situation where everybody feels they are enough, that they don't have to use their fists or their words in acts of violence to communicate the suffering that comes from knowing I have a gift inside, but nobody can see it and nobody can receive it? One of the greatest sufferings and one of the greatest sources of violence is rooted in the fact that we have so many people that we've treated as throwaway people. And this is not to excuse violence, because violence isn't there to be excused. But as you said, it's not there to be relieved either. It's there in many respects to be, what's the positive alternative to it? It's about the community renewal that creates those alternatives. So I loved what you were saying, Sharna, when you said, you're not there to just provide relief or programs. You're there to change the very nature of the social order. The poverty of the poor is not a call to relief action. It's a cry for social justice, and it's a cry for a better social order. So it's people like you, I think, that, convene those conversations, but you can't do it on your own. So your question around how we build that, I think, is a key question, but the question is what's powerful. I don't know what the answer is. You know that. Just practically on the publishing side of things, let's get that sorted. I'll get on to my publisher after this conversation, and between us, we'll figure out how maybe Louise and others can have some thoughts around that. We get the book distributed through local channels, and it should be local vendors anyway that are making money on selling the book, right? So, the principle of local is important here. So we'll get that sorted. But Sharna, thank you so much for everything you do.
So Cormac, before I hand over to Rama, so you do this often. You go into communities and they start with this very traditional top-down, government should lead and citizens should follow, or citizens should be quiet while government tell them what to do. And then you have processes and mechanisms and training and to help facilitate that shift. And you do it in a way that honors humanity and lead people on. So just, if there are people listening, Sharna, so what would you advise? Where does one start if you're a leader like Sharna, you can't do it all your own, you can't do it on your own, and you want to tap into what Cormac Russell and nurture development and has to offer, do a sales pitch on us.
Well, I'm cautious about sales pitches, but look, the entry points are different. So in Kenya and in Rwanda, particularly in Rwanda, interesting enough, it was through 39 schools and the Wellspring Foundation. And the schools, like yourselves, said, hey, schools aren't just centers for education, they're social centers, they're economic hubs. They create all kinds of possibilities. And by the way, that's more true today than ever, as we look around the world at how schools are often the only gathering places and bumping places that are now remaining open while many places are shutting down. So the school is social center, the school is economic hub. In Rwanda, became a movement in the Gasabo district in Kigali for over 384 schools, and that spread to Burundi, so the entry points are different. In Singapore, it was the social work reform. They'd begun to realize they took an English model, talk about colonialism, they took an English model of social work and they started applying it in Singapore. And lo and behold, within 3 years, the number of children that they were taking off of families and putting into institutions went up by 400%. I'm not critiquing the English model. I'm just saying that's what happened in the early noughties. They wanted to come and they wanted to shift from a case management style of social work into something that's very much about community social work. We work with police, so there are different entry points. When we've worked with government, really what we've been trying to say with different governments is, where's the energy? You're not going to change everything overnight, but where is their energy? Some countries, the energy is around the fact that their social care model is falling apart. I was just speaking to some folks in Italy, in Emilia-Romagna, which is a region in Italy, where the cooperative movement are actually taking over and creating community alternatives to social care for older people, because congregated care settings are no longer an okay way to deal with mental health and disability in older people, especially in a pandemic. They were sitting ducks, it's tragically. So we're seeing different entry points, but what do we do? Look, what we do is exactly this, have conversations. We also have the pleasure now online and on land, when we get back together in the room, of providing a really, really good quality training experience, like yourselves at Partners Possibility. We do believe in good pedagogy and giving people a set of tools and conceptual frameworks as well. So our introduction to ABCD is an 8 modular online piece because of where we are at the moment in the world. And really just, a lovely invitation to not just understand conceptually what we're talking about, but also apply it in practice. So that's one, but there are other ways. We're just, this is the book, by the way, because I know many of you haven't actually physically seen it. So we're just starting with our friends in Canada, in Edmonton and a number of other cities, setting up a stewardship circle around rekindling democracy with our friends at state and federal level there, so they can begin to think about what it's like to be a 21st century politician or public servant or senior executive, and thinking about precipitating citizen-led action as opposed to just providing top-down relief that Sharna was talking about. Look, at the end of the day, and you'll know this better than most, Louise, on the call, you've got to actually just sit with people, figure out what's going to work for them, and then put the supports around them. But loosely, that's how we show up. There is a little bit of structure, but a lot of goodwill as well.
So when Sharna starts to talk to her team, that's the first thing, is the 8-module introduction.
I think that would probably be as good a starting point as any.
And I think there's something really important about just the good pedagogy, because we've seen what happens when we don't really understand the essence. Rama, you've been sitting there quietly thinking. I can see the wheels turning in your head. What are your thoughts, responses? What do you want to ask Cormac?
There's so much going on, but I must just start up with Sharna's statement and to echo what Russell just said, that in fact, we can talk about the ideas, we can teach people about building community, but Sharna, it's people like you who are in positions of power, who have leverage, and then take the courageous stand to stand up and say, I'm going to be the disruptor. And in this call, there are 48 people on this call, and some notion of the challenge to say, we're all disruptors. So we have a choice right now. You read this book and look at an alternate way of turning up. How do we use our power and privilege and position to be the disruptors in this world? Because if we don't, then who will? And so that I had to get that out of the way. But Cormac, there's so much of gold in your book and your readings, but some things I want to pick up on, which might be useful for us as a community. In the book, you speak about the notion of it's not good enough to save one person at a time, but that the issue of the neighborhood and what that means, and the neighborhood as the smallest unit of change, is more important if we want structural change and systemic change, which is really what the book is about. It says if we want to dismantle this structure, saving one person at a time won't work. It's not enough. So somewhere in the book, you speak about the fact that not only is it important for us to get the right people into the room, to have the conversation, but that's not enough. Have the conversation about your reality and then activate it, and in your words, get off your bottoms and do something about it. It's this learned position of helplessness that there's nothing that we can do about it, that I think keeps us trapped in the space of let's leave it to someone else. So that's the first thing I'd like you to talk about. The second thing which intrigued me was your notion when you speak about community builders, and you say there are three things: connectors, conductors, and circuit breakers. I think it's a lovely metaphor, and if you could just expand on that a little bit, I found it quite useful, and it might be useful for us as a group as well.
That's wonderful. Rama, thank you, and thank you also for your friendship over the years and what you do. I think there's such a great connection between the community building work that you and Louise and others on the call have been promoting in South Africa, and this idea of community building at a neighborhood level. So whether it's in the conversation, in the room, or in the neighborhood, I think what we're really trying to understand is what's the scale at which we can go at the speed of trust, and that it is likely that culture change is going to spill out all over the place. And I think my money is on the neighborhood, because primarily that's where you can begin to get a whole set of things connecting and mobilizing together that it's hard to do in the scale of one-on-one conversations or even in a room, though it can happen in the room. So I think, for example, one of the things that it's possible to do, say, in a neighborhood of 5,000 people, is this whole vast repertoire of gifts, talents, knowledge, skills exist in neighborhoods which are largely disconnected. Most of us maybe know our neighbor either side, but to know their skills, to know their knowledge, I mean, many of us are in relationships, intimate relationships with people we don't even know what their passions and skills and knowledge might be. So beginning to tap into that, beginning to tap into the economy, the local economy, beginning to tap into local diverse culture and ecology, and also associational life. I often say that you could have a room full of wonderful solo singers, but that doesn't make them a choir. So there's a whole process of making them a choir, and we can do that in a room, but just down the street, there could be another wonderful group of people who are basket weavers, but don't know that they can each weave baskets because they're politicians and they're trying to lead the country. And there's a crisis on at the moment called COVID or whatever the crisis might be. So nobody stops to say, hey, we don't know how to fix this, but we can weave baskets, or we can, just the other day, it was Remembrance Day of remembering the Second World War. And in Scotland, the instruction came out that people were not allowed to put poppies out like they have in previous years. Well, the Knit and Natter group got into action and they basically knit poppies and put them out, so, but the football club also in the same neighborhood got together and they said to all of their members, you better get to know your neighborhood before you really get to know your neighbor before you really need them. And so each of them have adopted 3 of their neighbors who might be susceptible to the restrictions and the virus. And then there's another group, so when we start seeing all of these different networks coming together and connecting with each other, I think that association of associations in a neighborhood context, connecting with the well-being, with the skills, with the culture, and with the economy of community is a really powerful reservoir of possibilities that it's hard to get by just doing institutional change or behavior change in isolation. So this is why that scale is important. Why do I say it's not enough just to change one person at a time or one target group at a time? Because in many respects, it's the medical model. It's the old style model that says you're a problem that needs to be fixed. The solution is external to you. Now, this is one of the real reasons why we have learned helplessness, because a story has started to settle in on our bones. And the story is the only way things are going to get better for me is if somebody out there with the right credentials comes in and makes it better for me. The idea that somebody ordinary like me, living just a couple of doors up from me, could actually be the change I'm seeking is just, that's just so wild a thought. Now, the issue, and some people, I think, jump to this idea that people who are not taking the steps to showing up in their neighbors' lives or taking steps to change social action or social order are being irresponsible or being passive or being weak. I would contest that. I don't think they are. I think that what ends up happening is if you've got enough institutions in your life and you've got enough people through the media and so forth telling you this story, eventually you start taking the story on. It's like Humpty Dumpty, right? I start the book with the Humpty Dumpty nursery rhyme, falling on the wrong side of the wall. We were all schooled into thinking there's only one side, and that's the king's horses and king's men's side. And the first thing I say in the book is consider another story. Imagine, and it's not hard to do, it's just moral imagination. There's another side to the wall. We all know there's 2 sides to a wall, right? And on the other side are groups of people who have the ability to respond. They're not irresponsible or responsible. They have the ability to respond. Why? Because they're schooled in another story. The story that says, I am my brother's, sister's, planet's keeper. And I, in a sense, I am called forth from the culture of this place. This is why I'm very cautious about ideas like random acts of kindness. What we're seeing is not random acts of kindness. I think we're seeing rooted acts of kindness that come from culture, not from behavior. Got to get beyond behavior change and institutional reform into culture. Culture is what unites us as human beings. It has since we've, for 70,000 years. And the whole idea of connector, conductor, circuit breaker is just a way of codifying what it is that we do naturally and indigenously when we show up effectively as our brother, sisters, planet's keeper. The connector has basically abandoned the idea of the hero leader and wants to be in a situation where they're taking a connecting or convening role. They're inviting people and hosting people into a conversation. They actually believe that the leadership piece happens in the act of hosting, in the act of connection that comes between the people who weren't connected before, not embodied in any one person. You know, it's this idea that it gets the power of the leadership is at its greatest when it's cycling through the community. The conductor is that this is going to be hard. If we're transitioning from the old story that says the only way things are going to get better is if you get somebody from outside to come in and make it better, to the story that we're talking about on this call, there's going to be turbulence. There's going to be disruption. And that's exactly what COVID-19 did for us. It disrupted in a really powerful way and precipitated new conversations. So we need to find a way that during those times that lightning rods and conductors in our community can hold that turbulence, can hold that pushback. And that's about courage. It's not about people with expertise or technical know-how. It's people who have backbones that are like ramrod steel and are prepared to take the turbulence and understand that's part of the challenge. It's like Sharna's question, you know, the answer to how, as Peter would say, is yes, it's the showing up every single day. You know, there's no point in going to the dentist after not brushing our teeth for 10 years and saying, hey, I've got a cavity, you know, fix it. We've got to brush our teeth every day. And it's the same here, showing up every single day. Connectors, the conductors, the circuit breakers are the people who are prepared to say, to be witness to the limits of the conversations that we're having, that are prepared to be the truth tellers and the wayfinders, and who are prepared to do that not out of acts of anger or out of acts of division or out of acts of building the walls, but they're not selling us a lie, busted flush or a dud bill of goods, that are actually prepared to say that we may be 3 years going through COVID-19. We may be just 8 months into a 3-year cycle, we don't know, but we've got to accept the world as it is. It may be that there are other challenges that we're going to face, but we will prevail if we show up authentically and intimately. You know, one of the things I think that circuit breakers do is they say, maybe the reason we haven't built community is because we've gone into the forest of institutionalization. We've spent too much time in our offices, too much time in our heads, too much time in our books, and too much time in the marketplace. And they remind us that our good life is closer to home than we maybe been prepared to entertain. But I think it's intimacy that people have been running from. And that's what circuit breakers do. They call us back home again. It's the homecoming. That's what's needed here.
And Cormac, this has been, so we have been really encouraging each other to focus on the gifts of COVID rather than all the stuff that's gone wrong. And one of the gifts is being home. You know, one of my colleagues said to me the other day, he said, I've been married 47 years, but I've never spent 120 days at home. He said, I know my wife better now than what I knew before. And then the CEO of Standard Bank the other day, one of our massive banks, said, as a result of COVID, I'm now more integrated in my home. I now understand the challenges. I take the kids to school. I'm part of cooking. I will never let that go again. This has been so precious for me to be home. So we are experiencing some of that beauty of being home. I'm so conscious of time. People have been quietly listening. We don't have anybody contributing on the chat. So let me just open up, say if there's anybody on the call who wants to say something, maybe we are getting to the end. So maybe you want to just express appreciation. Any comments from anybody, and just the way to indicate that you want to say something is literally just unmute yourself and I'll keep an eye on who's unmuted. Want to hear some voices, because you've heard enough now from Sharna and Rama and Cormac and myself. Anybody want to say something? Justin
is asking a great question here. Justin, do you want to unmute and verbalize your question?
Yes. Thank you, Cormac. It would be much nicer to hear Justin's beautiful voice as well.
So thanks, Cormac, and thank you for this. You know, it seems to me that we would have been having a different conversation today had it been 450 or 500 years ago, and that maybe the idea is to go back to a time when it was simpler and more mundane, and the neighborhood and the community mattered and was the only thing. So my question is, can we go back there? We're all in this space, so our answer would be yes. But how do we start that en masse? How do we create a language and a common understanding of the beauty of the simple in a world which does nothing but promote the complex and the acquisition and the more, and the system upholds that?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things to critique the system, as you say, is to recognize that the system is very much about scale. So the whole idea is bigness. Everything that we've said, you know, in terms of the imperial notion of globalization and industrialization and capitalism in the turbo capitalism sense, is about bigness. It's about, you know, the sooner we get to the hyper global market, the better. And we're obviously contesting that and saying that we think a community alternative where the scale of conviviality is going to lead to better well-being outcomes and ultimately better business and more sustainable futures. So that's the essence of what we're saying. And it is a contested dialogue. And we saw that play out. We're seeing that play out in the UK with Brexit. We've seen it play out recently in the US elections. We're seeing it in Brazil play out. We're seeing it in terms of how some countries are politicizing public health in the name of political or economic. So what you're saying is very, very real. So here's a thought, which isn't a get out of jail answer, but is an honest answer. I don't think we take the empire on its own terms. So I wouldn't try to do this at the scale that the empire tries to do things, which is in terms of giantism. Therefore, I wouldn't try and do this en masse. I don't think we have to do this tomorrow. I don't think we have to get everybody to do this. This isn't about conversion. This is about conversation. It's about community. It's about smallness, but it's about smallness in authentic, deep terms at the speed of trust. We don't have to go faster. We really don't. But if we do that in a really genuine way and consistent way, I do believe things grow, you know, movements grow. We know this. And what I feel we have to do is think like social movements more. You know, we've seen the slow food movement. We've seen movements around permaculture. We've seen movements around well-being. You know, when you think about it, like this whole way of thinking, by the way, is I trace in the book and I say it really got going around about 1919. This is, as a concept, 100 years old. And when you think about it in terms of the arc of human history, that's not a lot of time. And it is possible, it really is possible. This experience of COVID will mark people in a very real way. We can have a conversation with bank managers in South Africa now that we couldn't have before. We can say, hey, do you know that in Australia, one of the quickest movements, social movements, is Bendigo Community Bank. There are 317 banks that are actually owned by local communities. And Bendigo Bank, which is an actual, you know, a stock market trading bank, saw it in their interest to support communities to own their own bank. What was going on there? What could they see after the Lehman Bank crash? Well, what they could see is that the only way they could build real reputational advantage as a bank and regain trust, which is a far more important collateral to trade in banking than money was if they started really doing the community building piece. But they're ahead of the posse. Now, might it be possible to go back to Louise's story and say that man who said he's gotten to know his wife after 47 years, who's become decolonized and has actually gone home, might also come home to the idea that he can use his influence now to start a community banking movement in South Africa? Why not? So some of this is about doing a heat map and starting with where the energy is. We don't have to go to scale. We just have to be real. And I think we start with where the possibilities are, partners for possibilities, and we go from there. Deeply rooted, you know, and stay in trouble, I think would be the other thing I'd say. It's always much more fun.
You're reminding me of again, you know, so for me, my awakening around this stuff definitely happened when Peter came the first time, and he kept reminding us that we changed the world one room and one conversation at a time. Which one? The one I'm in right now. So it really does feel to me as if we had one of those world-changing conversations. And I'm curious about the fact that people have been so quiet, but then I'm looking at their faces and I can see that they've been hanging off every word. So I want to just create an opportunity for maybe just 2 or 3 words of appreciation from people in this community. 41 people who've been hanging off every word. Anybody want to just say thank you? Edna.
I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm deeply moved by this. Well, anyway, you always come up with wonderful things, Louise, and I'm proud to be part of you. But so talking about COVID, the one good thing about it is it's proved we are all one people. And we've got to work on that. So that when the bug has buggered off, we got to work so that the oneness of all of us throughout the world stays and is consolidated. Thank you very much indeed.
So Cormac, you may not know that Edna is one of our very precious members of our community. She must be in her 80s now, and she has been awarded the member of the Baobab, Edna, but she's one of our awarded members of our community, a bit like being a dame in the US. Sorry, in the UK.
Lovely to meet you, Edna.
I sometimes think I've been awarded anyway, but yes, I'm 88 going on 18.
88 going on 18, exactly. And she's going to keep us on our toes all the way through. Thank you very much, Edna. That's a beautiful, it's beautiful. Someone called me the other day and she said she just wants to acknowledge me for always appreciating the old people. And I was thinking, actually, I'm so honored by anybody who's kind of older that it feels to me like I'm the beneficiary. So it was such an interesting inversion for me around that conversation. So I think we've come to the end of this conversation. Rama, let's do this in this order. So we'll ask Rama, Sharna, Cormac for final thoughts.
Cormac, a delicious meal. That's always in the making. 6 course to go to 12 and to 15. Always a pleasure to chat to you, my friend. And great to meet all of you in this community as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Rama. Sharna.
Mac, thank you, and thank you. This has been deeply inspiring. It's just so deep. I'm going to spend a lot of time doing introspection and reflecting. But again, you have shown us that there is a better way. And to Louise and Rama, thank you for making it happen. Like I said, it was a simple tweet, but I am the eternal optimist, and I do believe that there is a better future. And it's how we show up and how we honor each other in little circles, small conversations, one room at a time. So I'm deeply humbled that you actually acceded to our request, but now you just got to get the books to South Africa, and we promise you we'll get them off the shelves. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharna.
Thank you, Sharna. And Cormac, you have the last word.
It's a word of gratitude. This is all about gift exchange, about this idea that we really start changing things by recognizing that we are enough if we can see each other's gifts genuinely. And yes, we're all in the same storm. We're not all in the same boat. There's some really serious challenges to work on and some really serious issues. But I actually think just even in this conversation, what's so critical is as we lean into those challenges, that we do so in solidarity with each other, and even minding our language. I love the fact that you in South Africa were so quick off the mark to not use terms like social distancing, but to use physical distancing while remaining social, emphasizing solidarity, emphasizing connection, and really figuring out some of those more difficult challenges around how we celebrate diversity while not demanding unity, but figuring out ways that we can be in solidarity together. I feel I have so much to learn. The only thing I regret is that we don't have more time. Louise, a special thank you to you. A special shout out to Partners for Possibility and to your new book, which is a joy to read, and to Rama and to Sharna. Sharna, again, you're thanking me, but really, I learn what I meant to say in my book each time somebody like you reaches out, and Louise and Rama. So thank you for reaching out and for making this possible. And Rama, again, thank you also. So that's it, really. Just a word of gratitude.
Thank you, Cormac. I also just want to say from my side, I need these conversations because they inspire me. And so I feel so privileged every time to be hosting them. A really big thank you for everybody who showed up today. We've had people from India, from the UK, from Ireland, probably other people that I don't even know about. That's also changing. So in the old days, South Africans were always going to other countries to go and learn. We love the fact that people are coming to us as well to learn from what we're doing, and definitely hope that this will not be the last conversation. And Cormac, I definitely have on my vision board that we will host you in Cape Town as soon as we all are able to travel again, and that Sharna will help us to make that happen from a Western Cape government perspective. So we're very clear that we have some plans here. In the meantime, thank you very much, everybody. Go and have a wonderful evening with your families, given that you are home and you can cook your own meal and you don't have to go out for dinner. And let's stay in touch and join us on Twitter. We have lots of fun, Sharna and Cormac and myself on Twitter.
Indeed, we do.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Go
you
well.
so much, Cormac. Bye-bye.